Hey, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're joined here tonight by Ms. Holly Bull from the Center for Interim Programs as we discuss the idea of the gap year. There are many options for students after high school. The first word that comes to mind might be college. There's work, there's all sorts of options, and the gap year can be a really interesting option in between. So I don't want to steal Ms. Bull's thunder, but that's what she'll be discussing with us tonight. Before we go ahead and get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We are in a webinar format tonight, so while you won't be able to ask questions out loud, you are invited to enter them at the bottom of your screen through the Q&A function. And we will hold those questions until the end of the program. And then myself and Ms. Bull will be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. But feel free to type those questions in throughout the program, just so you don't forget them. We are also recording the program tonight, and we will be distributing that recording later in the week. That about does it. I'm going to turn the stage over to Ms. Bull now for the program.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And good evening, everyone. Lovely to speak with you tonight. I was just looking at how long I've been actually doing these presentations at Hopewell Valley. It was 2013, I think, was the first one. So I think it's been about 8 years total that I've been presenting on the gap year option to Hopewell Valley families. And, you know, since 1992, we work with about 34 students from Hopewell Valley over the years, just helping them through their gap time. And we have 2 this year, you know, from last year's senior class to this year who are currently on their gap year. And one of them is doing some really interesting things. So I'll talk about Finn's year. But first, just some background on interim. So I'm like a huge clearinghouse of program options. So the Center for Interim Programs is like a huge clearinghouse of vetted options. And we've been doing this work since 1980. And we are definitely the oldest independent gap year counseling organization in the United States. My father started the company after being a teacher for 10 years at Lawrenceville School, and then he was headmaster of private schools in the US and abroad for about 17 years. So my brothers and I grew up traveling and living in different cultures in Turkey, Austria, Texas, Arizona, and the breaks in the between in Princeton. And, you know, really my father was collecting program ideas back in the 60s. Nobody was really talking gap year. I mean, people took time, but there wasn't a term for it. And he was just throwing these ideas into a shoebox for about 20 years and then started interim in Princeton in 1980. And that's when I was graduating from high school. So I actually went to Princeton High School for my last 2 years and then took a gap year between high school and college. And then I took another year after my sophomore year. So I've done 2 full years. But at this point, you know, we've worked with over 8,700 students. Mostly students. We actually work with all ages. I have about 6 people between 55 and 65 who are taking gap time. 2 of them are interim parents who decided it was time for them to take some gap time. So it can really be for all ages. And we just have this, as I said, this large array of vetted options that we're pulling from as we work with the families. So I've worn a lot of hats in this field. I've been counseling for over 35 years now. All I do is gap year counseling. And I've worked with probably about 3,500 of the 8,700 students with whom we've worked over the years. I did this program. This was actually from my first gap year. So the picture of me there is I'm 17. I'm off in Hawaii. So my friends headed off to college. I was on a plane to Oahu to do aquaculture research, thinking, you know, maybe I want to be a marine biologist or at least major in that. And so I spent, 3-4 months scrubbing out shrimp tanks and chatting with scientists and getting a good sense of the daily do of the research. And probably realized, I took about a month or so before I realized I don't think I have the patience for this kind of work. Probably not something I'm going to major in or, do as work in the world. Good to know. Tick that one off. The picture there is actually University of Hawaii research expedition that I got on board. And the big eyeball that you see there is this dying female squid that we inadvertently pulled up because we were studying these tiny clear organisms, the bioluminescence in them, and up came the squid, which you don't normally see. And I just love this image because it gives you the hit of hands-on learning that's really different from sitting in a classroom, or you can't read about it, or you can't watch a TikTok video. It's not the same. You need to be on the deck of a boat in the sun, watching this creature come up from the depths, or something like that to bring the learning alive. So that was the first part of my gap year. And then I went to Greece on an academic cultural study program in the spring of my gap year. And then I ended up actually working for that program when I graduated from college for a couple of years. I ran their US office. And then I started working pretty much out of college as well with my father in the gap year counseling field. I also have two daughters. One is a stepdaughter, is 29 now, who took a gap year before college. And I'll reference Samantha further on. And then my daughter, Leah, just took a gap year the year before last, and she's now finishing up her first year of college. And so with her, I was really seeing up close and personal the effects of the pandemic, the pressures she was under, and luckily she talks to me, so I was hearing it, and the effect of her gap year just really clearly before she landed in college, you know, beneficially. It was really, I never force a gap year on anyone, including my own children, but I was so glad she took that time. So, and then my second gap year, I went to India and Nepal. I went back to Greece. I did service work in Kentucky, you know, and I'm 60 at this point, and those 2 years are still vivid in a way that classes tend not to be. And I don't mean to knock formal academics, but I've done master's work, but in terms of what stays with you over time, the hands-on learning is really powerful, and it informs your, you know, like the formal academics, the one informs the other. So it's great to have both. All right, so just quick back up here. Most people know what a gap year is now. I just define it as this opportunity to explore interests and skills, but with intentionality. This is not like a year off, time off, where you don't put some thought into it. You really need to focus in on where your interests are and how you can start matching those with experiences. Typically, it is between high school and college. And then the next wave of students are taking a break from college. So those are stepaways, as I call them. And that might be a semester or a year, or it could be post-college. But typically it's around 3 to 9 months. And this is very much a year on. You know, when people say, oh, I'm taking time off or you're off, baloney, you know, you're so on because you have to be. You're stepping into things that are really different, probably from what you've done before, and you're very much alive. And people tend to feel like they come back alive. So you can be sort of scared and exhilarated at the same time. Who takes a gap year? Anyone who's interested, you know, again, all ages, but mostly students can take the time. You know, most of the parents I talk to want to go and they can't. And all different types of learning styles. You could be a super high-powered student, you know, racing off to some top school, and you just want to have a breather to go and explore interests and take that into the college classroom. You might have, you know, decent student, you're just not sure what you want to get at, and you want to take some time. You could have learning differences, and it gives you a real breather from the formal academics, where you may not be performing as well as you might in some hands-on setting. You know, I'm pretty sure I would have been diagnosed with ADHD in high school. They weren't doing that at the time. But with my gap year, I found that it was really great to be able to hyper-focus on things that I was drawn to, you know, and that I chose, and have a break from all these different classes coming at me, not all of which I was that interested in. So, you know, a whole different environment in terms of learning styles. And you don't have to be good at anything. You know, you could be terrible at something. Who cares? You know, none of this is usually for grades. It's all for learning. It's just pure checking things out that you're drawn to and see where that takes you. For me as a counselor now doing this work for so many years, the core of it still remains this process that I see with students, really shifting away from living from the outside in to the living from, like, working from the inside out. So what do I mean by that? So, you know, we're all pretty much put in school when we're 5 or 6. We're typically expected to go to college. There are a lot of, I have to do this, I'm supposed to do that, what will people think, this is due, all these directives that come at us from the outside, and we're living in reaction to those for a good part of our early lives, and sometimes our later lives. With gap time, you really are just stepping back from that, off the track, and leading from the core question, like, who am I? What am I doing on this planet? What am I interested in? Okay, now I'm going to go check these things out, and I choose and own what I'm up to. And what you have is a year, potentially, where you're practicing what it feels like to choose and create your life. And I always tell people that's the beginning of personal power. There are people in their 30s, 40s, 50s who don't have a sense that they have a full hand in their life. And I put it to you, you have to practice that. So if you can start doing that at 18 or 19, it's going to stand you in such good stead no matter what you do, college or work world or whatever you do beyond. It's a real missing piece, I think, for many people. It almost matters less what you do during gap time than the fact that you're choosing what you're doing. Now, having said that, obviously there are better options than others, but basically that's a good core premise to work from. All right, so lots of benefits here. Obviously, if you're choosing something you want to do, you're going to be more motivated. So students tend to pick up a lot of steam because they're really interested in what they're going toward. This is a big one. I'm seeing students who are pretty fried. A lot of anxiety and depression, just, the aftermath of the pandemic and overall sort of stresses. And I don't think a summer is often enough time for people to fill back up and rejuvenate before they take on 4 more years or more of schooling. And I definitely saw that in my stepdaughter, Samantha. She was pretty fried. She said, I'd forgotten what it was like to have full vitality. She said it was my normal to be that tired. So during her gap year, she began to feel like, wow, I really have energy again, and took all of that into college. And then the relevance of your studies to the world. This was a big one for me. Okay, I go from math class to history to Spanish in school here. How does this stuff connect as a curriculum? How is it relevant to the world around me? And if you're halfway intelligent, you start to question, what is all this stuff I've been cramming into my head all these years for? How does it connect to the outer world? And so when people take gap time, they're getting a sense of that relevance, and that gets them excited again about their learning. And they, again, take often that into the college process. I think most students and parents can help with this, begin to have a much better sense of just budgeting. So, my family sat down with me and said, hey, here's what we can comfortably put toward your gap time. You need to work to chip in for it. So I paid for all the airfare during my year, round trip Hawaii, round trip Greece, one program volunteer, one program that had a fee of about, I don't know, $3,000 at the time. That was a very reasonable year for my parents, who had 2 other children in college ahead of me. And then I had more ownership for it. And I asked my daughter Leah to do the same thing, and so did Samantha. Work in the summer, pitch in for the year, and then you can start to see students really paying attention to how much things cost. So when my daughter Leah spent the last month of her gap year just doing free travel in Europe, she did everything. She bought the flights, she set up the youth hostels, she was on a budget, so she took 3 flights to get places, which I wouldn't want to do, but she was on a budget, it was cheaper. And that's a really good skill to start getting earlier on when there's more incentive to think about it. And then everything you do during gap time goes on a resume. You're front loading skills, in the world skills that will probably be more useful for you than most classes in the work world post-college, or just going right into the work world if you decide, I don't want to do college. So you're gaining all these different skills that sometimes students, well, I'd say often, students don't necessarily have when they graduate from college. And so when students sometimes worry that they're going to get behind peers because they graduate a year later, and not that this is a competition, but the reality is they're way ahead of the game by virtue of these skills that they're garnering during gap time. And these skills help you get jobs. One of the things that my stepdaughter Samantha did was an internship at the very end of her gap year, working for a little startup company in Ireland. And she said, she was at 19, basically she was living the way you live post-college with a little more support and, fellow interns for company. But she said, I'm pretty sure I got my job with IBM based on that internship that I did in my gap year when I was 19. She said, the only thing we talked about pretty much during the interview was that experience. And they told her, Samantha, you got this job because of your gap year. How she showed up in that interview was different. Sense of self, self-confidence. Yep, I can handle myself in the world. People pick that up about you as soon as they shake hands with you almost. And it's hard to see that quality in yourself, but I've seen it in so many gap year students when they test themselves in the world and they realize, you know what, I'm fine. So this is another big one, just getting a better sense of, do I want to focus on marine bio or not, or business or teaching or journalism or whatever it is that I might be drawn to in terms of a major or work in the world. Let me go stick my toe in the water of that field and see if I like it. Because there are people who graduate with majors and get into something and say, wait a minute, I don't particularly care for these people, or this is not what I thought. And there are people in med school who hate it. So you could head a lot of that off through this very systematic ticking off of your interests one by one, like sticking your toe in the water of these different areas of interest without having to make a huge commitment to it, and see what you think. And then, as I said, how you transition, from college into the work world is different because you've already stepped into the world, like this trial run at 17, 18, 19, and it really makes a big difference for these gap year students. All right, now, how do these students perform in college? Because the myth is, if you take gap time, you're going to lose academic momentum. Maybe you're going to forget how to learn. How is it going to affect, or maybe it'll derail you from going to college? And the reality with these gap year students, they're performing at higher levels than non-gap year students. And it's actually very rare, if somebody's planning to go to college, that a gap year will derail them. You're more likely to see students going straight from high school into college and then stepping away. The rate of attrition is actually pretty high because students are getting there and they're realizing, okay, I'm still going from class to class. I'm not sure what I really want to get at. This isn't that different from high school. What am I doing? So, it's to my mind, take the break between, which is a more natural break, and don't waste that time and money in college. Go do the front-loaded exploring before you land. Anyway, so this is the data for how these students are doing. This is older data now, but it's still relevant with more recent data, 2011 to 2014 here. Excuse me, that Bob Clagett did when he was Dean of Admission at Middlebury College. So he was in Harvard admissions for many years. And then when he got to Middlebury, he just started to track the deep GPAs in blue of the gap year students compared to their peers in red, class by class. So this is first year GPA, second year, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior of the first year, and then the classes on the web. So basically what he saw is that these students were performing several percentage points higher than their peers. Most of them hadn't done anything formally academic for a full year. So you might be a little rusty. You're not going to forget how to learn. And what happens with these students is they're hitting the ground running. I definitely felt this when I landed in college. You're refreshed, you're excited about the learning, you know more what you want to get at or not. And you tend not to be as derailed by some of the things that people are doing in freshman year. You're really a lot clearer. The other thing that Bob noticed about the gapper is the Feb admit students. So students who just had the fall away before they started in Middlebury in February, he said a disproportionate number of those students were walking away with all the leadership awards at Middlebury. It's like, what's happening in 3 months that's affecting that change in those students? And I would say it's all the stuff I've been talking about. Those students had to think more proactively. What do I do with my fall? And that proactive energy they took into Middlebury, and it made them different, more proactive students. Here are the numbers that Bob crunched for UNC Chapel Hill. Same results, even more dramatic. The light blue are the GPAs of the gappers compared to their peers. And again, these students typically were not doing formal academics during their gap year. And Bob was accounting for these students' academic history coming in. So what he was seeing with these students, they were outperforming themselves, like how they were expected to do, and they were outperforming many of their peers. This must have been 8 or more years ago. I was on a gap year panel with Mark Hatch in Colorado in college admissions. Mark was also in Harvard admissions for a number of years. They've become a research hub now in the past 5 or 6 years for the gap year. But this was before that Mark was saying, here's what we're seeing at Colorado College. First year GPAs of these gappers are higher. This was interesting. I was scribbling this down like mad. He said the gap year young men are outperforming non-gap year young women at Colorado College. And they're like way outperforming non-gap year male peers. So these students, especially the young men who have a year more, are landing and doing really well. And these students, male and female, are leaders on campus, the gap year students. The behavioral issues, their dramas, their roommate issues and all that stuff, excessive partying, this is just not on the radar screen. These students are really solid when they land. And this is something I heard from my daughter, Leah. She said, I still have highs and lows. Nothing rocks my core, she said. My core is solid. So she's navigating college far more powerfully than she would have the year previously. And he said, these students are finishing college in 4 years or fewer. So they're really efficient students. I don't know if you know this, but the average number of years often to finish college is 5 or 6. because students are changing majors, they're changing schools. Every time you do that, it can add more time in the classroom, which starts to get really expensive given the college tuition these days. So gap year students are really efficient students. And Mark was saying, we'd like to see 20% of our incoming freshman class have taken a gap year. I think they're higher than 8 to 11%. I'm not sure what it is now, but the other thing he said, which is really unusual at the time, he said, if you're applying to Colorado College, tell us you've done a gap year or you're planning to take one. He said, it will help you get in. He said, on every level, you're a better student for us. You make us look good. And now that they've become a research hub, they're looking at levels of anxiety and depression going down in gap year students, decreased number of disciplinary incidents, especially among young men. These are the things that I can tell you anecdotally we've been hearing for years, because we have this huge alumni pool. And the common refrain is, my child's a better student. I'm a better student, more rested, more focused, all of these things that they're getting from this year of exploring. So remember I said, if you spend less time in college, it could be quite a savings. So if you're spending 4 years versus 6, you could be looking at a chunk of change, depending on which college you're attending, because you're going to be a more efficient student. And you typically are not spending this amount of money on a gap year. I mean, you could do nothing but room and board placements, the options that give you housing and food in exchange for your labor, and still derive the same kinds of benefits that make you a better student. So it's not like you have to do all these snazzy programs or exotic things on a gap year. It's just something about this process of the student exploring and having this time away from the familiar, away from home, taking this challenge on. So these are some of the universities that actually run programs or have scholarship money that support it. There are many, many universities who are supporting gap year now, but Princeton, as you may know, has the Bridge Year program, the Novogratz program. So you have to get into Princeton, then you apply for the Bridge Year program. It's like a year, like a Peace Corps year, where you go and do service work abroad and live in another culture for the full year, and then you start at Princeton. And it changes a campus. You can't have students off in Africa or South America for a year coming back in, and their heads are in a different place. It will change the quality of the student body and what they're up to. Tufts has the 1+4 program, which is the community service work that they do. UNC Chapel Hill provides money each year for a small group of students to go do their gap time. Florida State, and then Duke is the most recent. And most of this funding comes from alumni donors who are saying to the universities, hey, we'd like to support this. This is really important for these students to do. Okay, potential pitfalls and challenges. So when you're creating your gap year, what do you want to pay attention to? So ideally, you don't want to force a gap year on a student. I have had a number of parents drag their children into interviews with me. And what's interesting is often students don't realize what this could be. So more often than not, what I find is that students kind of turn toward it, and I'm not their parent, so in the best sense, I don't care what they do. I just say, these are possibilities. Here's why you might want to think about doing this. And so then they get really excited and realize, okay, this sounds really good. But if somebody says, Holly, this sounds interesting, and I really want to go to college or do whatever, I'm supporting that student with the parent saying, the core of this is that they're going to choose and own. So if I choose and own college, or I choose and own working locally, or whatever it is, that's really important to listen to. Because if you force it, it just belies the whole power of choosing. You want to avoid poorly run programs. There are some duds out there. And then the year as a whole, because often people are doing combinations of things through a gap year, not just one thing necessarily. It does have more moving parts and it takes more work. So as I said, there's more going on with this. It's still not a traditional path, so you might need more support and guidance. It's also really common that students are changing as they go through the year. So the plans need to change accordingly. When the student steps into this fall, say doing a gap year, they have no idea where their heads are going to be come November, which is normal because they're changing. So you can tinker with your plans as you go. And then it's like, okay, how are we going to afford this? Is it, sometimes people think, is this another full year of college tuition? You don't have to bleed financially to have a great gap year, but it is a good thing to think about in terms of, okay, well, how for parents, like, how can we comfortably put some money toward this, or what are we willing to put toward a gap year, and then bring the student into that conversation. So here's what students worry about. I don't want to get behind my high school class, or am I going to be too old as a college freshman landing after a gap year? That was a big one for my daughter. She turned 20 the day before she started college. And as she was thinking about a gap year, she said, I'm going to be ancient. I don't know if I want to do that. She said, I'm so glad I took the year. She said, yes, I did feel more mature. And she said it was so worth it for what I got from my gap year. And you're not so age bound in college. So it really helps. So, you're not behind. I always tell people you're on a parallel track. Friends are going off to college or whatever they're doing. You're stepping into experiences, and everyone disperses after high school anyway, but you're stepping into something in the fall, probably connected with a peer group. You don't have to disconnect from your peers. And these are students who normally be in college, around your age, who are choosing that experience, and they have a common interest. Leah said that she found it easier to make friends on her gap year because these were small groups of students with a common interest compared to the sea of freshmen when you land in college. So yeah, there's no getting behind. As I said, these students are often way ahead. And then, the thing that you may feel is a bit of a disjoint because you are more mature. My stepdaughter Samantha said I was the go-to person in my dorm when I landed in college. She said I kind of liked it. She thought it was an advantage. So here's what's out there when I say program or options. I separate them into 4 main categories, sort of what's out there. And this first category are the facilitated group programs that are specifically set up for gap year students. Typically, these are running 2.5 to 3 months. They could be shorter. They could be, 4 weeks, but you're guaranteed a group of gap year peers. They could be all Americans. They could be international students, but definitely a group. And they're smaller groups generally. So you're looking at like 10 or 12. There's some are larger, but if you're moving around a lot, 10 to 12 students is about a good size. And leaders. So it could be, hey, we want to go off and do a cultural study type experience. So you're in Central or South America, living with local families and doing service work and adventure travel, sightseeing, just helping out and having this overview of the culture or the language immersion. Or it could be, working, doing something more like art history or studio art in Europe. Or you could do academics. And, I have students who've gone off to England and done classes with international students, not for credit or grades, just because they wanted to take classes and took what they really were interested in. Or it could be marine related, or it could be outdoor adventure. So you've got a range of these that students are doing either in the fall or the spring. Generally, I find that people, if they're going to splurge on a group program, it's a good one to start with in the fall. It fills the fall really nicely, gives you most structure and support. It launches you. And you're looking at these programs now that are running 14, 17,000, some are 20,000 a semester, not including airfare. These, by the way, if you're on a budget, many of them have scholarship money, or they're accredited. So you could use 529 plan money, college money to pay for them, even if you can't garner the credit to present to the colleges. Because if you apply to college and defer, many of the colleges will say, fine, take your gap year, but don't garner credit. We want you to come in as a regular freshman. Next category are the skill-based intensives, as I call them. So you pay for these much less. These are shorter, like 1 to 4 weeks. They can be longer. This is a 3-month program building a guitar, but you could do it in a month at another location. Or it might be, hey, I want to go off and learn how to teach skiing or snowboarding or yoga or scuba diving, or I want to get my wilderness EMT, my medical training, or do cooking intensives or writing intensives, learn how to run a recording studio, filmmaking classes. So these are US and abroad. They provide you with housing and fellow students, but it could be a range of ages with a common interest. So you're not alone. And you land, and in a short period of time, you're getting a lot of information fast, or you might come away with a certification. So these are great to tuck into gap time now or down the line. I always tell people, weave these into your college years, post-college. It's a great way to pick off an interest and not spend a lot of time or money on it, and just see where it takes you, and you're garnering more skills. Third category are what I call urban internships. Typically, they are in cities. And these are placements, and these are hard to find. Internships for gap year students are one of the hardest things to find. So we're recommending people work with internship providers. That's all they do. They arrange the housing for you. They arrange the substantive internship, and you've got built-in social life with fellow interns with whom you're living. And there's a local contact person. So you have an orientation and then you're launched. And so both my daughters did programs like this, one in Ireland, one in South Africa. And I never push program types on people, but boy, if you're interested in something like this, I'm going to nudge hard because these are so incredibly practical. First and foremost, like, do I like this work? Do I like these people? And then the next is, hey, this goes on my resume. I have translatable skills from this work experience. And I've lived like that half step into the world. The independent living skills are also part of this kind of a placement. So you might pay a couple $1,000 and then the housing and food costs, but what you're getting is the experience and the training, which is really useful again when you are going to enter the work world or try and get future internships or summer jobs down the line. So when my daughter Leah was doing her internship, she worked with a human rights lawyer, excuse me, this past winter in South Africa. And she was living in shared apartments with fellow interns. She had to cook for herself, clean up after herself, ideally, head out the door every day to her job-like placement with this human rights lawyer. And at one point she wrote to me and she said, I just realized I'm not really on a program. I'm just living independently in a city. And I said, right. Well, you kind of are on a program, but however, yes, you are living more independently and you are living the way you're going to live probably post-college. And it won't be so daunting for you when you transition from college into the work world. And you could see that sense of self-confidence because she had to initiate more with this more independent placement. So a lot of students will do these. Some will do them in the fall, but a number of students might do them in the second half of the gap year because they are more independent. And these are all different areas of interest: business, finance, museum work, medical stuff, research, journalism, teaching. Could be service work, and you could be in Dublin, Ireland, you could be in Barcelona, Spain, you could be in London, England, you could be in Cape Town, South Africa, you could be in Sydney, Australia, Auckland, New Zealand, Buenos Aires. I have a young man in Argentina right now who's doing an internship there and getting a lot of fluency in Spanish. And these are really quite powerful to pull into your year. Typically, you're committing, generally, it's like 6 to 8 to 12 weeks that you need to step in and do these things. The longer you stay, the more interesting the work tends to be. Okay, last category here, all the volunteer work type experiences. So these are much more low cost. Like the first 3 categories, you're paying something for them and they're set up for you. These, you're going to be of service to someone or something. And so these are more rural, working on farms, building projects, with animals, wild or domestic, on board boats, coaching kids in sports, teaching in classrooms, assist teaching, disaster relief work. So you could be with a crew of people. This is like a group program, but much more low cost, helping to rebuild post-hurricane damage or earthquake damage, in the US or abroad, or helping, with refugees, Ukrainian refugees in Poland. And you're living with fellow volunteers and you get housing and food for the work that you're doing. Or it could be trail work in national parks. Some students will also work at home for part of their gap year or for the full gap year. And that's okay too. The only challenge that I see if you do that for the whole year is you're not away from home and the familiar, and friends may be gone. So it can be kind of lonely, because the things you want to watch out for, you want well-run programs, you want enough going on during your gap year, and you want community, especially post-pandemic, just more people, at least for part of a gap year. And this is what the year can, excuse me, look like. It doesn't have to follow this blueprint, but you can see it pretty much follows a school calendar, which I think is reassuring for students because basically they're home when they would be if they were like coming back from college. So they work in the summer, do their own thing in the summer, head off in the fall, something will fill the fall, and then home in between to see friends and family. Sometimes students will reapply to college halfway through a gap year or apply to college halfway through a gap year. And then January through May, you've got about 5 months where you might be combining the more independent placements like internships or volunteer or the skill-based trainings. And then the summer, typically people are back maybe working or doing free travel. Often students are meeting other gappers, and by the end of a gap year, you often see people traveling together, and they learn a lot from that. So that's what my daughter Leah did, in in May of her gap year. She said, I don't think I could have done that at the start of my year, organizing all of it. But by the end, she was fine. And look at the skills that go into that are going to help students, now and down the line. And then, off to college or join the workforce, et cetera. I had a young man who had no interest in college. He went off and learned how to run a recording studio, which was his interest, then got an internship in Philadelphia at a studio, and then they hired him on. Straight shot to work that he loved. Okay, how and when do you start planning a safe gap year? By spring of senior year, it's pretty common. So students in the fall of senior year, usually they're pretty busy with just trying to get their college applications out the door, and there's still enough time. January of your senior year onward, like right now is a really busy time. The people have to make a deferral decision, so they're deciding on their gap year and making plans for this coming fall, and there's still time to do that for this year's seniors. And then just check your college deferral requirements. Dan can speak to this as well, but some of the state universities don't offer deferrals. Wake Forest is not offering deferred years, so you want to make sure you can defer if you're in somewhere. And can you transfer credit in or not? Do they allow any kind of credit? Or if you have scholarships or financial aid, can that be also deferred? Because sometimes that has to be dispersed in the same year. And then this option to potentially reapply to college. Sometimes people don't get in where they want to go, or they really change. And some of these students do reapply. Excuse me. It definitely helps to talk to your high school counselor about getting support again to circle back around, to go through another round of applying. I mean, the ideal scenario is you apply during your senior year, get in, ask for a deferral, and you're set. A number of us gap year counselors will do this free brainstorming session. I mean, we have always offered an hour and a half Zoom call. Part of our mission is just to educate people about the gap year. And it really helps parents and students understand how this works and what might be possible for that student. And there's no obligation, to work with the counselor, but you'll come away with a lot of information. Start by identifying just general interests and locations. Our interest sheet is a great way to just see, okay, where in the world might I want to go and what am I drawn to? And then how do I match those with the options that I'm finding? Update your passport, check, medications, mental health supports, make sure those are in place if you're going to be traveling, etc. And then define the budget. And I mentioned that it really helps if parents sit down with the students, say, hey, this is what we can comfortably or are willing to put toward your gap year. And then looking at scholarships, financial aid. If people are on a really tight budget, gap year counselors provide scholarships. We always will help people if they need help. And then programs have scholarships. And then there are really low cost options, as I mentioned. And then looking at your 529 plan money. People tend to live vicariously through your travels. So, set up a blog and tell people to fund your year. Ask for college money, graduation money, sorry, and just see if they will help you out with your gap travels. And then I always tell everybody, then work, even if you don't have to, work and pitch in for your year. It's your year, take responsibility on that level. And because the program costs range so widely, you really can do a year where it's mostly either low cost, you're just covering housing and food costs, or the options that will give you the room and board, and then you can work as well. So I like this image just because it's our Western lives. Here's to the top. I think this is something that we're so used to in the West, being very linear and goal oriented. This is your academic track, and here's your gap year plan. And our lives aren't this tidy. Our lives are messy. There's COVID. How do you roll with this setback? All these things that you're grappling with, these are also front loaded during a gap year, but this is also what you're getting so many skills from. And also it's the richness of life experience that you're front loading now in your life when you're not tied to much. And this is where parents start to drool. It's like, God, I wish I could do this, but I can't step away from my obligations. And with students who are taking gap time, they're not tourists. They're travelers, which is different. And they have wells of time where they're dropping into these different experiences. And it's really unique. It's not something that you can do later as in your life as easily. Okay. Thank you all. Any questions at this point, Dan? If you see any questions in the Q&A, I'm happy to answer them.
Sure, yeah, we we do have a couple. The first one, if you wanted to take a gap year and then apply to college during that year or after, how would it work with accessing your school's records, Naviance, college recs, and et cetera, since you've already graduated? And I can certainly speak to that. While you wouldn't still be on your counselor's caseload at the high school, our office would still certainly be there to support you as an alumni any way that we can. We use Parchment for ordering transcripts for alumni. So there's a link right on our website where alumni can order transcripts through Parchment and have them sent directly to colleges. And then by contacting our office, we could help you get past any hurdle that might be in the way in terms of securing recommendation letters or Naviance, anything along those lines. We will help you navigate all of that.
Yeah, and I think what I find is that most students are, well, often they've gone through the process already, so they kind of they know the drill. And even students have said, should I just wait? And sometimes I'll say, look, you might want to go through the process just to learn the process. Don't apply to loads of colleges, but pick a few and just send them out. And if you do get in where you want to go and you're set, great. If you want to reapply, you need to build in the time to do that. Now with early decision applications, you don't really get much of your gap time to speak from before you have to get those applications out the door. But the later deadlines, you should be able to at least have the fall experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where like your essays, the guts of an application can become more interesting because you've stepped into an experience and you're excited about talking about it. And then you can talk about what you're planning to do and why. So if you're saying, hey, I really want to go to your college, I'm going to be doing an internship in business or, teaching or the arts world, museum work, or whatever it is, or medical work. And this is what I want to get at in your university. And look what I'm coming into your college with. You can really play up these skills that you're bringing to the colleges.
Yeah, and we talk to students all the time about in terms of marketing oneself to colleges or to creating a really good application file. They want to see students who've developed some real world skills, who've learned to navigate obstacles, learn to overcome challenges. And, I think just by knowing that a student is engaged in a program like this, it'll give them confidence that these applicants have developed some of those skills compared to their peers who are applying right out of high school. Yeah.
And right now, what I've been hearing from both sort of the freshman college staff as well as gap year programs is that a lot of these students are really delayed, and the pandemic has done such a number on people, or they're not really mentally solid, like emotionally solid. So I think a college would much rather have you just take a break, give yourself time, there's no rush, and come in as a really solid student. Like Leah said, I have the highs and lows, but she's just not all over the place. She's like, nope, my core is solid. I also heard recently that this was it was actually a woman who runs the UNC Chapel Hill's Moorhead Keene Foundation. She works for that program, the scholarship program, and she said we did some research and we were asking employers and alumni, what's the missing element in college graduates? And the two things they came up with were the ability to work in groups. And then also this ability to deal with gray areas. Because I think what's interesting about gap time, and I had a young woman who went off and worked with elephants. It was an elephant farmer project looking at how the elephants in Africa were like moving across farmers' fields. And this was a real issue. And Emma, the girl who went there, was all for the elephants. It was very black and white. And then when she got there, she said, I realized that this is such a complicated issue the farmers are trying to live on this land, the elephants are ruining their crops. Like, how do you deal with this and hold both sides, which is, and the gray, and just because so much of negotiation is dealing with gray. And so I think those interesting skills sometimes students aren't getting just by sitting in a classroom. But if
Yeah.
you step into a group and you've got to deal with people in close quarters before you hit college and before you go into the work world, these are really great skills. And the colleges know it. I mean, it's not a guarantee, but I've had so many students reapply and get into places they didn't get into before. And I think they were just a different candidate for the colleges.
You mentioned students wondering, like, will I forget how to be a student essentially by taking a year off? And that was a conversation I had with a student not long ago. And I said you don't forget how to learn, first of all, and you're going to be learning through this entire experience. It might be a different style of learning. It might be, a little more real world and less from the textbook, but I think that's a good thing. And I think it would, and I likened it to riding a bike. I think once you do get to college, you're only 1 year removed from high school. And I think it'll come pretty naturally.
Yeah, it's not something that I've heard people, and I do talk to a lot of alumni, and it's not so much of an issue. Like I said, the main thing that people see is that they feel more mature. And so, when you get to college, if you take a gap year, you want to seek out fellow gap year students. As I said, join the clubs and you'll be fine.
And then we had another question. Do programs generally accept kids under 18? My son will only turn 17 after high school graduation.
That's a great question. I'm actually just interviewed a young woman who's 16 graduating from high school, and then she's going to be 17 halfway, the second half. The volunteer type programs generally won't take you until you're 18 because of liability. So what you're probably going to have to look at are more things like the group programs that'll take you at 17, or like a language program that will actually take you at 16. So this young woman could go study German at 16. Or there are other placements, like in Costa Rica, we have a wonderful contact, and I would have sent my daughter to him at 15. That's how much I trust him. So there are options like that you can do, even if you're on the younger side. And if it's rare that a student is 17 through the whole gap year. Sometimes it's part of the gap year, so at least they can do the group programs, when they're 17, and then they can move into more independent options. But if it's 17 the whole year, there's still things that that can be more independent, but you have a little bit narrower array of the low cost options, especially.
Perfect. And then we had one final question. Can you explain the room and board placement option a bit more?
Yes. So when I say room and board, you get housing and food in exchange for whatever work you're doing. So for example, the disaster relief work that you could do for a week or longer, you land, the housing set up for you. And I visited sites where all these volunteers were living together in decent housing. I mean, it's basic, but it's fine. And you got meals provided for you. And then you're heading out and doing whatever work, just helping to rebuild. So it's drywall and painting and roofing and so forth. Or it could be, hey, I'm going to go help on a farm, and they're going to give me housing and food in exchange for helping in the garden. Or I could go, as one of my students recently did. She was in The Hague in the Netherlands working at a youth hostel. And when I say working, she's not getting paid money. But if you're not covering housing and food, all you have to do is get yourself there, and then you have miscellaneous expenses. That's pretty good. And to be in a city and get housing and food while you're working at this youth hostel, meeting all these international young travelers, and then having time to putter around the city, she loved it. I mean, it's pretty independent. So these are, again, things that sometimes people will do for the second half of a gap year. But I've had students do nothing but room and board placements through the whole year. Some things might even give you a stipend. So I have placements where people have worked at like an outdoor ed center with middle school, waves of middle school students coming through, and they get housing, food, and a stipend. There's another program where they'll set you up, you pay a fee to them, almost like a headhunter, and they'll find you jobs in resorts in the United States. And so you're getting paid, the housing's arranged for you, getting paid. And usually you can either defray, like come break even, or you can come away with, I think he said about $1,000 for that kind of a placement. So it's away from home, but you have structure and support when you're doing those. I would say most of the room and board placements tend to be more independent. They don't guarantee you a peer group or a volunteer group, but a couple of them do. So it depends on what you're looking at. That was a long-winded answer. Yeah.
I'm sure it's much appreciated. I think, actually, let me check back. I think we have another
Anything else
question.
there?
Yeah, we have, let's see, do you always have to apply to a college and defer your
No.
application? So the answer would be no. How does application work during your gap year if reapplying or applying to new schools?
Yeah, so what I find is that students will assemble the colleges in the summer before they start in the fall. And then if they can do something where they can actually work on essays, the sort of final bits of the application in the fall. Sometimes people take the fall off to do a whole reapplication process. I mean, I understand why they feel like they might want to do that, but I think if you're home and everyone's gone in the fall, that can be lonely. And
Mhm.
to my mind, at least try and do something maybe in November, December, like a carrot out in front of you, so that you could step into something at least for part of the fall.
Yeah, but
You
I
know,
would,
maybe
I
you
would
wanna-
see wanting to get as much of it out of the way as
Yeah,
possible, you know,
yeah,
in August, September, before going away. So that it's not looming, you know, while
right.
you're trying to immerse yourself in this experience.
Yeah, and there's some locations that are just really harder to
Yeah,
have consistent Wi-Fi. I mean, you're tromping around in, Europe or
yeah,
Africa. Europe's easier, but down under, or the hardest one is the one that my daughter did, where you're just hiking and backpacking, camping. I mean,
yeah,
you don't have Wi-Fi for chunks of time, which she
yeah,
loved, but makes it harder if you're trying to reapply. So
yeah.
we take all that into consideration when we work with people.
Yeah, and it goes back to the value of going through the application cycle senior year of high school anyway,
Yes.
even if you don't intend on accepting any of those offers, because then
Yeah.
when you do it that next year, it's going to come that much easier, and you won't
Yeah.
have the support of your full-time high school guidance counselor there, you know, to work with you every day.
Yeah.
So I could see that familiarity being really valuable.
Yeah,
Um,
and I mean, my feeling just about gap time, I don't know, who's listening, but for you all, I've had so many people say, my child did the brainstorm and got a sense of the gap year and just felt like relieved that it wasn't just, okay, it's just college or I'm sort of a dropout or something. It
mhm,
was, there's college, there are all these really interesting options. And even if they choose college, they felt better, even going through the college application process. It took the pressure off of them in that regard. So I think just offering this as a possibility to people is huge. I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I think that for some students, even if they don't do it before college, knowing that if they go to college and it's like, wow, this is not really working out, or even post-college, I haven't figured out what I want to get at, or I need more work experience, that's when you can take this time. It doesn't have to be before
yeah.
college.
I think it's just good to understand that, you know, up until now, kindergarten through 12th grade has been very scripted, and
Yeah,
you've had to do the same thing. You know, it's been determined each year what you're going to do the following year. Upon graduation, there is that freedom. And we often feel like we're supposed to enroll right in college and get a degree in 4 years, but
right.
we don't have to. That might be the path for some people, but there's many paths to follow after graduation. And I think this can be a really valuable one for some.
Yeah. And I think just the freedom, the mental freedom people have, not to be so run by our environment.
Mhm.
You can exploring exploring in this way doesn't derail people. I mean, I
Mhm.
find that people get far more on track, if you will, aligned with who they are and what they're most interested in. And that leading from that core and really practicing that's why I love this work. I mean,
Yeah.
because I see people getting so powerful in that process. And then they can take on anything after
Yeah.
that. So,
One
so yeah,
last question. Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah.
I
No,
was
no,
going to
no,
say
that's fine.
one last pet question was posed about kind of I guess the application process for these programs. Are there academic
Yeah.
requirements for these placements, or is it a competitive application process for some of them?
No, that's a great question. And generally with GAP programs, you can get into anything that has space. So you want to apply in a timely fashion. Some few options, like there's a really intensive art program in Europe, you might need a portfolio to present to them. But generally, you should be able to get into anything. If you have some red flags in your application, maybe you've been going through a lot, so the program's going to want to know is like, are we a good fit for you, given what the program involves? You know, how much structure and support do you need? But generally, these are the application process, the timeline is going to be shorter than certainly applying to college. So I have students who will sign on in August, you know, to start in September. It's not ideal, but it's still doable with a number of options, just because we know so many different things. But right now in the spring, you know, if people right now are deciding, okay, I want to take a gap year, I'm going to send in my deferral request, then they have this period of time, late spring into summer, to set up the fall. And the beauty of this is you don't have to set the whole year up. You know, you can start nailing down the fall, and then you're sort of chewing on these other ideas for the winter to spring. And usually there's enough time. Also, you're not traveling on special visas. You're usually traveling as a tourist. So you have up to 3 months where you can travel most places in the world. Get your passport updated. You know, normally you're not being paid, so that you need to look at options that are giving you the room and board if you want to keep the costs down, or you're paying a minimal fee. But all of that is set up when you apply to a placement. Excuse me, they're pretty much like taking you from there. So then you have that support as you go along. Excuse me.
Excellent. All right, well, we don't have any more questions in the hopper. So I think that does it for our program tonight. I just want to thank you again, Ms. Bull, for joining us and for joining us each year.
Yep, you're
Really
welcome.
interesting information and just another valuable opportunity to present to all of our students and families. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you all for attending. I appreciate your interest. And I'm here right here in Princeton, New Jersey. Just call me if you have any questions or send me an email.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much. And everybody have a great evening.